The wind howled across the Montana territory like a banshee, carrying with it the bitter promise of death for any creature caught unprepared in the wilderness. Jake Morrison pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out of his small log cabin into the swirling snow. The storm had been raging for 3 days now, and his supplies were running dangerously low. Jake was a solitary man by nature, having chosen the isolated life of a homesteader after spending years driving cattle along the dusty trails from Texas to Kansas. At 32, he had seen enough of humanity's darker side during the recent war between the states to prefer the honest company of horses and the vast open sky. His small ranch sat in a valley between 2 rolling hills, far from the nearest settlement of Willow Creek, which was itself barely more than a trading post and a handful of weathered buildings. The barn stood about 50 yards from his cabin, its wooden walls groaning under the assault of the winter wind. Jake needed to check on his animals before the storm worsened. His 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck and an aging mare called Sadie, along with a handful of cattle, depended on him for their survival in this harsh landscape. As he trudged through the knee-deep snow, his boots crunching with each labored step, something caught his eye near the fence line. At first he thought it might be a fallen branch or perhaps debris blown by the storm, but as he moved closer, squinting through the driving snow, his heart nearly stopped. There, collapsed against his fence, was a horse unlike any he had ever seen. The animal was magnificent even in its current state of distress. Its coat, visible beneath a layer of ice and snow, appeared to be a deep chestnut with darker points. The horse's breathing was shallow and labored, creating small puffs of vapor in the frigid air. Ice had formed around its muzzle and eyes, and its legs were folded beneath its body in a position that spoke of complete exhaustion. Jake approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones, as his father had taught him years ago back in Missouri. The horse's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice, but its eyes remained closed. This was clearly a wild Mustang, probably separated from its herd during the storm and driven by desperation to seek shelter near human habitation. The cowboy knew he had little time. In this weather, the horse would not survive another hour without intervention. Despite the risk of dealing with a wild animal that might panic and injure them both, Jake could not stand by and watch a creature die when he had the power to help. He returned to his cabin quickly, gathering several thick blankets, a rope, and a bottle of whiskey that he kept for medicinal purposes. The wind seemed to grow stronger as he made his way back to the collapsed animal, as if nature itself was testing his resolve. Kneeling beside the Mustang, Jake began the delicate process of assessment and rescue. The horse was a stallion, probably 4 or 5 years old, with powerful muscles visible even beneath its winter coat. There were no obvious injuries, but the animal was clearly suffering from severe exposure to the elements. Working carefully, Jake managed to slip a halter around the stallion's head. The horse stirred slightly, but lacked the strength to resist. Using a combination of gentle encouragement and physical assistance, Jake helped the animal to its feet. The Mustang swayed dangerously, its legs trembling with weakness, but it remained upright. The journey to the barn felt like an eternity. Step by careful step, Jake guided the exhausted stallion through the snow. The horse leaned heavily against him, its breath coming in ragged gasps. More than once, Jake thought the animal might collapse again, but somehow they made it to the relative warmth and shelter of the barn. Inside the barn, Jake's own horses whinnied nervously at the presence of the wild stallion. Buck stamped his feet and snorted, while old Sadie backed into the corner of her stall, her eyes wide with concern. The Mustang, however, seemed oblivious to their reactions, focused entirely on the simple act of staying alive. Jake quickly prepared a stall, spreading fresh straw and hanging several lanterns to provide both light and a small amount of additional warmth. He rubbed the stallion down with rough blankets, working circulation back into the animal's limbs while speaking continuously in soothing tones. The horse's eyes opened as Jake worked, revealing an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth. There was no fear there, only a weary gratitude that touched something deep in the cowboy's heart. This was no ordinary Mustang, Jake realized. This animal possessed a spirit and presence that set it apart from other horses he had known. As the night wore on, Jake remained in the barn, monitoring his unexpected guest. He offered water, which the stallion drank gratefully, and a small amount of hay, though the horse showed little interest in food. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the barn's walls, A fragile peace had settled over the unlikely pair. Jake dozed fitfully in the hay, starting awake periodically to check on the Mustang. Each time he looked, the horse's condition seemed slightly improved. The ice had melted from its coat, revealing the true magnificence of its coloring, and its breathing had become steadier and more regular. By dawn, the storm had finally begun to subside, though snow continued to fall in gentle flakes. Jake stretched his aching muscles and prepared to face whatever challenges the new day might bring, unaware that his act of compassion had set in motion events that would change his life forever. The first light of dawn crept through the gaps in the barn walls, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Jake stirred from his uncomfortable sleep against a pile of grain sacks, his back aching from the night spent on the hard ground. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed almost unnatural after 3 days of howling wind. He rose slowly, brushing straw from his clothes, and turned to check on his unexpected guest. The Mustang stallion stood in the corner of the makeshift stall, its head raised and alert. The transformation was remarkable. Where the night before there had been a half-frozen dying animal, now stood a creature of obvious strength and nobility. The horse's coat had dried to reveal its true magnificence. It was indeed a deep chestnut color, but what Jake had not noticed in the darkness was the unusual marking across the stallion's face, a perfect white star that seemed to catch and reflect the morning light. The animal's mane and tail were thick and wild, testimony to its life running free across the Montana plains. "Well, friend," Jake said softly, approaching the stall with careful movements, "you're looking considerably better this morning." The stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound of his voice, but the horse made no move to retreat. Instead, it studied Jake with those same intelligent eyes that had struck him so deeply the night before. There was something almost regal about the way the animal held itself, as if it understood that it had been saved and was acknowledging the debt. Jake offered fresh water and a handful of oats, which the Mustang accepted gratefully. As the horse ate, Jake noticed the animal's excellent condition beneath the effects of its ordeal. This was no ordinary range horse struggling to survive. The stallion's build suggested superior breeding, perhaps descended from Spanish horses brought north by early explorers and traders. Buck and Sadie had grown accustomed to their new barnmate during the night. The old mare actually seemed curious about the newcomer, occasionally stretching her neck over her stall door to catch the stallion's scent. Buck, ever the territorial male, maintained a respectful but watchful distance. After tending to all the animals and ensuring they had adequate feed and water, Jake stepped outside to assess the storm's aftermath. The world had been transformed into a pristine white landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Snow had drifted against the cabin and barn walls, creating sculpted formations that would take days to melt, even when the sun emerged fully. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of tree branches settling under their burden of snow. Jake's nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the trail to Willow Creek would be impassable for at least a week. He was truly isolated, responsible not only for his own survival, but now for that of the rescued stallion as well. As he stood surveying his snow-covered domain, Jake began to formulate a plan. The Mustang would need time to fully recover from its ordeal, and the weather would prevent any immediate attempt to return the animal to the wild. He would care for the horse until spring arrived and the passes cleared. Then he would help it find its way back to wherever it belonged. The decision felt right, though Jake could not have explained why. There was something about this particular horse that spoke to him on a level beyond mere compassion for a suffering animal. Perhaps it was the intelligence in those dark eyes, or the dignified way the stallion had accepted help without losing its essential wildness. Inside the cabin, Jake prepared a simple breakfast of bacon, beans and coffee over his wood-burning stove. The familiar routine of cooking and eating helped restore a sense of normalcy after the dramatic events of the previous night. Outside, the sun finally broke through the clouds, sending brilliant beams of light across the snow-covered landscape and through his small windows. After breakfast, Jake returned to the barn to continue caring for his animals. The Mustang had finished its morning feed and was standing quietly in its stall, seemingly content to observe the activities around it. Jake noticed that the horse showed no signs of wanting to escape or return to the wild immediately. Perhaps the stallion understood, in whatever way horses comprehend such things, that it was safer here for now. The day passed peacefully. Jake spent time repairing tack, checking his supplies, and planning the work that would need to be done once the snow began to melt. The Mustang watched everything with keen interest, as if studying the routines of domestic life. Occasionally, Jake would speak to the horse, sharing his thoughts about the weather or his plans for the ranch. As evening approached, Jake prepared for another night in the barn. He was not yet ready to leave the stallion unsupervised, unsure how the animal might react to being alone in an unfamiliar environment. He spread his bedroll near the stall and settled in for what he hoped would be a more restful night than the previous one. The Mustang seemed to appreciate his presence. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, the horse would occasionally move to the side of the stall nearest to where Jake lay, as if drawing comfort from human companionship. It was a behavior that surprised the experienced cowboy, who had always believed that wild horses viewed humans as natural enemies. Just before falling asleep, Jake found himself wondering about the stallion's history. Where had it come from? What had happened to separate it from its herd? Most Mustangs traveled in family groups, led by a dominant stallion, and it was unusual for a mature male to be wandering alone during winter. Perhaps this horse had been challenged by a younger rival and driven out, or maybe some other tragedy had befallen its companions. These questions would have to wait for answers that might never come. For now, it was enough that both man and horse had survived the storm and found in each other's company a temporary refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. Neither could have imagined that their meeting was only the beginning of a story that would become legend in the territory, a tale of trust and understanding that bridged the gap between the wild and the civilized world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and perhaps new revelations about the mysterious stallion that had appeared in the storm like a gift from the very spirit of the untamed West itself. Jake woke before dawn to a sound he had never heard before in his years on the frontier. It was low and rhythmic, like distant thunder, but it came from outside his barn rather than from the sky. He sat up quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that always lay within arm's reach. The Mustang stallion was standing alert in his stall, his ears pricked forward and his nostrils flaring as he tested the morning air. The sound grew louder, and Jake realized with growing amazement that it was the thunder of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats. He pulled on his boots and coat, grabbed his rifle, and stepped carefully toward the barn door. The stallion whinnied softly, a sound that seemed almost like a greeting rather than a warning. Jake cracked open the barn door and peered out into the grey, pre-dawn light. What he saw made him question his own sanity. Spread across the meadow in front of his barn were dozens of horses. Wild Mustangs stood in the snow, their breath creating clouds of vapor in the cold air. They were arranged in a rough semicircle, as if they had gathered for some purpose known only to them. At the front of the group stood a magnificent black mare, clearly the lead horse of this wild band. Her coat gleamed like polished coal in the dim light, and her bearing spoke of intelligence and authority. She was looking directly at the barn, specifically at the door where Jake stood hidden. Behind her, the rest of the herd waited with an almost supernatural patience. Jake counted at least 30 horses, ranging from mature stallions to young colts staying close to their mothers. Their colors varied from bay and chestnut to paint and gray, but all shared the lean, powerful build of horses born to run free across the endless plains. Some bore the scars of battles with predators or rival stallions, while others showed the sleek perfection of youth. The stallion in Jake's barn began to pace restlessly in his stall, clearly agitated by the presence of his wild kin. He whinnied again, louder this time, and the call was answered by several voices from the gathered herd. Jake felt as if he was witnessing something sacred, a communication between creatures that humans could never fully understand. Slowly, Jake opened the barn door wider and stepped outside. The entire herd turned to look at him, but none showed signs of fear or aggression. They simply watched, as if waiting for something. The black mare took a step forward, her intelligent eyes studying the human who had appeared in their midst. Jake had heard stories from old-timers about the mysterious ways of wild horses. Some claimed that Mustangs possessed an almost supernatural ability to communicate across vast distances, calling to their own kind when help was needed. Others spoke of horses that could sense things beyond human perception, gathering in times of change or significance. Looking at the assembled herd, Jake began to understand. These horses had come for the stallion he had rescued, somehow through means he could not comprehend. They had known that one of their own was safe, but separated from them. The storm had passed, and now they had come to reclaim what belonged to the wild. The stallion in the barn grew increasingly agitated, his hooves thundering against the wooden walls of his stall. Jake realized that he faced a decision that would define not only this moment, but possibly the rest of his life. He could keep the barn closed and wait for the wild herd to leave, maintaining his possession of the magnificent animal he had saved, or he could open the stall and allow nature to take its course. Jake walked back into the barn, conscious that dozens of wild eyes were watching his every movement. The stallion met his gaze with those same intelligent eyes that had first captured his attention. But now, there was something different in the horse's expression. Where before there had been gratitude and acceptance, now there was longing and a barely contained need for freedom. "I know, friend," Jake said softly, approaching the stall door. "They've come for you, haven't they?" The stallion stamped his feet and tossed his magnificent head, his mane flowing like liquid fire in the lantern light. Every line of his body spoke of his desire to rejoin his kind, to return to the life he had known before the storm separated him from everything familiar. Jake's hand rested on the latch of the stall door. He had saved this animal's life, nursed it back to health, and provided shelter when shelter meant the difference between life and death. By any measure of frontier law or custom, the horse belonged to him now. Yet he knew with absolute certainty that keeping the stallion would be a betrayal of everything the animal represented. With deliberate movements, Jake opened the stall door. The stallion burst out immediately, his hooves ringing against the wooden floor of the barn as he headed straight for the open door and the freedom that lay beyond. Jake followed, watching as the magnificent animal emerged into the morning light and rejoined his wild family. The reunion was unlike anything Jake had ever witnessed. The black mare approached the stallion, touching her muzzle to his neck in what could only be described as a gesture of welcome and relief. Other horses in the herd nickered greetings, and several of the younger animals pranced with obvious joy at the return of what Jake now realized must be an important member of their family group. The stallion turned back toward Jake one final time. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended the usual relationship between human and animal. It was acknowledgement, gratitude, and perhaps something even deeper, a recognition of kindness that would not be forgotten. Then the stallion reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air in a display of pure wild power. His call rang across the valley, a sound of freedom and joy that seemed to shake the very mountains. The rest of the herd answered, their voices joining in a chorus that spoke of unity and the unbreakable bonds of family. As suddenly as they had appeared, the wild horses began to move. The black mare led the way, and the stallion took his place among them, his white star catching the early morning light one last time before he disappeared into the herd. They flowed across the snow-covered meadow like a river of living power, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm that seemed to match the very heartbeat of the land itself. Jake stood watching until the last horse disappeared over the ridge, leaving only tracks in the snow as evidence of their miraculous visit. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the memory of something extraordinary that had touched his ordinary frontier life and transformed it forever. In the days following the departure of the wild herd, Jake found himself changed in ways he could not fully explain. The memory of the stallion's grateful eyes haunted his thoughts, and he caught himself frequently looking toward the ridge where the horses had disappeared, half expecting to see them return. The routine of ranch work continued, but everything felt different now, as if he had been granted a glimpse into a world that few humans were privileged to witness. A week passed before Jake saw them again. He was repairing a section of fence damaged by the storm when movement on the distant ridge caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be elk or deer, but as the figures grew closer, his heart began to race. It was the Mustang herd, moving slowly across the snow-covered landscape in his direction. This time, they did not approach as close as before. The herd stopped at the edge of his property, perhaps a quarter-mile from the barn, and seemed content to graze on the sparse winter grass they could find beneath the snow. Jake set down his tools and walked slowly toward them, not wanting to frighten them away, but unable to resist the urge to get closer. The black mare spotted him first, raising her head to watch his approach. She made no move to retreat, but her body language suggested wariness. Behind her, Jake could see the chestnut stallion he had rescued, his white star clearly visible, even at this distance. The horse was watching him too, and Jake felt again that strange connection that had formed between them during their time together. Jake stopped when he was still 100 yards away, instinctively knowing that this was as close as he should come without invitation. He stood quietly, simply observing the magnificent animals as they went about their daily activities. Foals played in the snow while their mothers kept watchful eyes on potential dangers. Several stallions maintained the perimeter of the group, alert for any threat that might endanger the herd. What struck Jake most was the obvious intelligence and organization of the group. Every horse seemed to have a role and purpose within the larger community. The black mare was clearly the leader, making decisions about when to move and where to graze. Younger horses deferred to their elders, and the stallions worked together to protect the more vulnerable members of the family. After an hour of peaceful observation, Jake began to walk slowly back toward his ranch. As he moved away, he heard a familiar whinny behind him. Turning, he saw his rescued stallion standing at the edge of the herd, looking directly at him. The horse took several steps in Jake's direction, then stopped, as if torn between two worlds. This pattern continued for several days. The herd would appear at the edge of Jake's property, graze peacefully for a few hours, then disappear again into the vast wilderness. Each time, the chestnut stallion would acknowledge Jake's presence with that same meaningful look, creating a bridge between the wild and civilized worlds that neither fully understood, but both seemed to value. Jake began to anticipate these visits, timing his outdoor work to coincide with the herd's appearances. He found himself talking to the horses from a distance, sharing his thoughts about the weather, his ranch, and his solitary life. Though the animals were too far away to hear his words clearly, he sensed that his voice carried a familiar comfort to at least one member of the group. The winter began to show signs of weakening. Longer days brought stronger sunlight that started to melt the snow in exposed areas, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. The creek that ran through Jake's property began to flow more freely as ice dams broke and released the accumulated waters of the storm. Spring was still weeks away, but its promise could be felt in the changing rhythms of the land. One particularly warm afternoon, Jake was surprised to see a single horse approaching his ranch. It was his rescued stallion, moving with purpose across the meadow toward the barn where Jake was working. The rest of the herd remained on the ridge, watching as their companion made this solitary journey. Jake set down his tools and waited, his heart pounding with anticipation and uncertainty. The stallion approached to within 30 feet before stopping, close enough for Jake to see the individual whiskers around his muzzle and the intelligent sparkle in his dark eyes. For several minutes, man and horse simply looked at each other, sharing a moment of mutual recognition and respect. Then the stallion did something extraordinary. He lowered his magnificent head in what could only be interpreted as a bow, a gesture of acknowledgement that transcended all the barriers between their species. Jake felt tears sting his eyes as he understood the depth of gratitude being expressed. This proud wild creature was thanking him not just for the rescue, but for the greater gift of freedom that had followed. Jake reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out an apple he had been saving for Buck. He held it out in his open palm, not moving closer, but offering it as a gesture of friendship. The stallion considered for a long moment, then stepped forward and gently took the fruit from Jake's hand. His lips were soft and careful, his breath warm against Jake's palm. As the stallion ate the apple, Jake spoke softly to him. "You know you'll always be welcome here, friend. This land is big enough for all of us, wild and tame alike. You've got family to look after now, but remember that you've got a friend here too." The stallion seemed to understand. He touched his muzzle briefly to Jake's shoulder, a contact so gentle and deliberate that it could only be called a caress. Then he turned and trotted back toward the ridge, his family, and the wild freedom that was his birthright. Watching the horse rejoin his herd, Jake felt a profound sense of completion. He had been chosen to play a role in something larger than himself, something that connected him to the deepest rhythms of the natural world. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years felt less oppressive now, tempered by the knowledge that he had earned the friendship of creatures whose trust was not easily given. As evening approached and the herd disappeared once again into the vastness of the Montana Territory, Jake realized that his life had been permanently enriched by this unexpected encounter. He had learned that sometimes the greatest reward for letting something go was the knowledge that it might choose to return, bringing with it gifts more precious than possession could ever provide. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it challenges that would test the unusual bond between Jake Morrison and the wild Mustang herd. The snow melted rapidly, turning creeks into rushing torrents and transforming the peaceful valley into a landscape of mud and standing water. With the changing season came new dangers, and Jake soon discovered that his connection to the wild horses would demand more of him than he had ever imagined. The first sign of trouble came on a morning in late March when Jake stepped outside to find only a portion of the Mustang herd grazing near his property. The black mare was there, along with several mares and their foals, but many of the stallions were missing, including the chestnut horse he had rescued. The remaining animals seemed agitated, moving restlessly and frequently looking toward the southern pass, where the others had disappeared. Jake saddled Buck and rode out to investigate, following the clear trail left by the missing horses in the soft spring mud. What he found filled him with dread. The tracks led directly into Hangman's Canyon, a treacherous gorge known for its unstable walls and flash flood potential. Local ranchers avoided the area, especially during spring runoff, when sudden storms could turn the narrow canyon into a death trap. At the canyon's entrance, Jake dismounted and studied the ground more carefully. The hoofprints told a story of urgency and possibly panic. Something had driven the stallions into this dangerous place, and Jake feared the worst. Horse thieves had been reported in the territory recently, professional rustlers who captured wild horses to sell to army posts, or eastern buyers who cared nothing for the animals' welfare. Jake knew he could not enter the canyon alone. The walls were too steep and the footing too treacherous for a single rider to navigate safely. He needed help, but his nearest neighbor was a day's ride away, and by the time he could organize a rescue party, it might be too late. The weather had been warm, and afternoon thunderstorms had become frequent. If a flash flood caught the horses in the narrow canyon, they would have no chance of survival. Riding back to his ranch, Jake was surprised to find the black mare standing near his barn, separated from the rest of her herd. She was clearly distressed, pacing back and forth, and frequently calling out with sharp, anxious whinnies. When she saw Jake approaching, she trotted directly toward him, something she had never done before. The mare stopped just a few feet away from Buck, so close that Jake could see the worry in her intelligent eyes. She looked directly at him, then toward the canyon, then back at him again. Her message was unmistakable. She was asking for his help to save her family. Jake dismounted and approached the mare slowly, speaking in the same gentle tones he had used with her injured stallion months before. To his amazement, she allowed him to come within arm's reach, though every muscle in her body remained tense with anxiety. When he extended his hand toward her neck, she did not flee, but actually leaned into his touch, accepting comfort from this human who had proven himself trustworthy. "I know, girl," Jake said softly. "I know they're in trouble, but I can't get to them alone. The canyon's too dangerous." The mare seemed to understand his dilemma. She stepped back and looked at him intently, then moved toward Buck and actually touched her muzzle to the gelding's neck. Buck, usually nervous around wild horses, remained calm, as if he too sensed the gravity of the situation. An idea began to form in Jake's mind, so audacious that he almost dismissed it immediately. But as he looked into the mare's desperate eyes, he realized it might be their only chance. If the mare trusted him enough to guide him, and if her knowledge of the terrain could supplement his human reasoning, they might be able to find a way to reach the trapped stallions. Jake quickly gathered supplies: rope, his rifle, water, and food for what might be a long journey. The mare watched his preparations with obvious impatience, occasionally calling out toward the canyon, as if trying to reassure her missing family members that help was coming. When Jake mounted Buck, the mare immediately began moving toward the canyon, looking back frequently to ensure he was following. Other members of the herd fell in behind them, creating a strange procession of wild and domestic animals, united by a common purpose. The mare led them not to the main entrance of Hangman's Canyon, but to a narrow deer trail that climbed up the side of the southern ridge. Jake had never noticed this path before, hidden as it was by scrub oak and fallen rocks. The going was treacherous, requiring all of Buck's sure-footedness and Jake's experience as a rider to navigate safely. As they climbed higher, Jake began to understand the mare's strategy. From the ridge, they would be able to look down into the canyon and assess the situation before committing to a rescue attempt. It was exactly what any experienced tracker would do, but Jake was amazed that a wild horse had developed such tactical thinking. Near the top of the ridge, the mare stopped and looked back at Jake meaningfully. He dismounted and crept forward on foot, using the cover of boulders to approach the canyon rim without being seen. What he observed below confirmed his worst fears and filled him with admiration for the trapped animal's courage. 6 stallions, including his rescued chestnut friend, were trapped on a small island of high ground in the middle of the canyon floor. Rising water from the spring runoff had cut off their escape routes, and the walls were too steep for them to climb out. Worse yet, Jake could see evidence of human activity. Rope corrals and the remains of a campfire indicated that rustlers had indeed been involved in driving the horses into this trap. The thieves had probably planned to return with equipment to extract the horses once they were weakened by hunger and thirst. They had not counted on the spring floods arriving so quickly, turning their trap into a potential death sentence for the magnificent animals they had hoped to capture and sell. As Jake watched, the chestnut stallion raised his head and seemed to look directly at him across the impossible distance. Even from the ridge, Jake could see the intelligence in those familiar eyes, and the trust that had developed between them during that long winter night when they had first met. The horse was counting on him, just as the black mare was counting on him, to find a way to save them all. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Jake saw dark clouds building to the west. The afternoon storms were beginning, and time was running out. Whatever plan he devised would have to be executed quickly, before the weather made rescue impossible and turned the canyon into a watery grave for some of the most magnificent horses he had ever seen. The rescue that followed would become legend in the Montana Territory, spoken of in hushed tones around campfires for generations to come. Jake Morrison, guided by the wisdom of a wild mare who had chosen to trust him, completely accomplished what no single man should have been able to achieve in the treacherous depths of Hangman's Canyon. Working with desperate efficiency as storm clouds gathered overhead, Jake used his rope-working skills learned during years of cattle driving to create an intricate pulley system anchored to the massive boulders at the canyon's rim. The black mare seemed to understand every aspect of his plan, positioning herself and the other horses to provide the pulling power necessary to extract the trapped stallions one by one. The most dangerous moment came when Jake rappelled down into the canyon to secure the rescue lines. The chestnut stallion he had saved months before approached him without fear, allowing Jake to slip a harness around his powerful chest. As the first horse was lifted to safety, the others watched with an intelligence that transcended anything Jake had previously attributed to animal behavior. The operation took 4 hours to complete, with the last stallion reaching the rim just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, the narrow canyon filled with roaring water that would have swept away any creature caught in its path. The timing had been perfect, guided by instincts and cooperation that bridged the gap between species in ways that Jake would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Jake and the Mustang herd evolved into something unprecedented in the frontier experience. The horses established a permanent territory that encompassed Jake's ranch, creating a unique partnership between wild and domestic life. The black mare and her family provided protection from rustlers and predators, while Jake's ranch became a safe haven during harsh weather and a source of medical care when injuries occurred. The chestnut stallion, bearing his distinctive white star, became a regular visitor to Jake's barn. Never fully domesticated but no longer entirely wild, he represented the bridge between two worlds that had found a way to coexist. Children from the growing settlement of Willow Creek would make pilgrimages to Jake's ranch just to catch a glimpse of the legendary horse who had been saved by human kindness and had repaid that debt with loyalty that transcended all natural boundaries. Jake's reputation spread throughout the territory. He became known as the man who could speak to wild horses, though he always insisted that it was they who had taught him to listen. Travelers would seek him out for advice about dealing with Mustang herds, and his methods of gentle persuasion, rather than violent capture, began to influence how others approached the magnificent animals that roamed the frontier. Years passed, and Jake watched generations of foals grow to maturity under the protection of the unique alliance he had helped create. The original black mare aged gracefully, eventually passing leadership of the herd to one of her daughters, but the bond between human and horses remained strong. Each new leader seemed to inherit the understanding that Jake Morrison was not just a neighbor, but a member of their extended family. the chestnut stallion lived to a remarkable age, his white star becoming a symbol of hope and cooperation throughout the Montana Territory. When he finally passed away peacefully in the meadow where Jake had first rescued him, the entire herd gathered to pay their respects. Jake buried the magnificent animal on a hillside overlooking the valley, marking the grave with a simple stone that bore only the date and a carved star. The story of the cowboy who rescued a freezing horse and gained the friendship of an entire wild herd became part of the folklore of the American West. It was told and retold, growing in the telling, but never losing its essential truth, that kindness, when offered without expectation of reward, has the power to create bonds that transcend all natural barriers. Jake Morrison lived to see the frontier transform from wilderness to settled land, but the meadow around his ranch remained wild, protected by generations of Mustangs who remembered a debt that could never be fully repaid. His legacy was not measured in acres owned or cattle branded, but in the trust of creatures who had chosen to bridge the gap between freedom and civilization. When Jake finally passed away at the age of 78, he was found peacefully in his favorite chair on the porch, looking out over the meadow where wild horses still ran free. The current herd leader, a magnificent grandson of the original chestnut stallion, stood vigil by the cabin until the funeral was complete, as if saying goodbye to an old friend whose kindness had defined the character of an entire territory. The ranch was eventually donated to the territorial government, with the stipulation that it remain forever wild, a sanctuary where the descendants of that first rescued stallion could run free. A simple plaque marked the spot where Jake's cabin had stood, bearing words that captured the essence of his extraordinary life. Here lived a man who proved that the greatest strength lies not in conquest, but in the courage to show mercy to those who cannot repay it. The Mustangs still run free in that valley today, their hoofbeats echoing across the generations like a promise fulfilled, a testament to the enduring power of compassion to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The white star marking that appears occasionally among the herd serves as a reminder that some bonds transcend death itself, creating legacies that inspire long after their creators have returned to the earth they loved so well. Thus ended the story of Jake Morrison and the wild Mustang who taught an entire territory that the true measure of civilization lies not in how completely we dominate the natural world, but in how gracefully we learn to share it with those who came before us and who will remain long after we are gone.